He spent his last savings on a quiet piece of land, believing silence might finally let him breathe again. A veteran Navy SEAL, worn by years he never talks about, and a German shepherd trained to notice what others miss. The land looked peaceful under the summer sun, but peace doesn't mean empty. When his dog suddenly stopped walking, instinct said what logic could not. Buried beneath grass and light was something never meant to be remembered. And the hardest battle wasn't underground. It was choosing whether to stay silent or do what was right. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Stories. Miles Kincaid drove north with the windows down, letting the warm air wash through the cab like a slow, deliberate breath. The road narrowed as it climbed, asphalt giving way to pale gravel that crunched softly beneath the tires. On either side, birch trees stood tall and bright, their white bark catching the sun like polished bone. Beyond them, darker pines rose in dense ranks, releasing the sharp, resinous scent of summer heat. The sky above was impossibly blue, wide, open, and unburdened. It felt wrong, almost, for a man like Miles to be entering a place like this. At 43, Miles carried himself with the quiet density of someone forged for endurance rather than display. He was tall, just over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, his posture straight without stiffness. His face was angular, the lines around his mouth and eyes set deep, not from age alone, but from years of choosing restraint over reaction. A short beard darkened his jaw, kept trimmed more out of habit than vanity. His skin was sun-worn, a tone earned outdoors, not at leisure. His eyes, gray-blue, steady and watchful, stayed fixed on the road ahead. They had learned long ago not to dart. Beside him on the passenger side, Vesper sat upright, muscles relaxed but ready, amber eyes tracking the movement of trees and sky with disciplined attention. The German shepherd was 6 years old, fully mature, his black and tan coat short and dense, built for work rather than show. He did not pant idly or press his nose to the glass like a pet discovering novelty. He assessed, he listened, he measured. Miles had driven farther with less certainty before. The land he was heading toward lay near a chain of northern lakes, the kind that reflected the sky so cleanly it was hard to tell where water ended and air began. He had found it by accident, or what passed for accident in a life shaped by patterns and aftershocks. The listing had been brief. The price had been lower than it should have been. Too low. The paperwork explained why. Conservation easement, development restriction, mineral rights reserved. Miles had read those lines twice in the county office, the paper smelling faintly of dust and old ink. He understood what they meant. He understood what they cost. He signed anyway. He wasn't buying freedom. He was buying quiet. When the truck finally rolled to a stop at the edge of the property, the engine ticking softly as it cooled, Miles sat for a moment longer than necessary. Ahead of him, the land opened gently, sloping toward the lake through tall grass and scattered wildflowers. Sunlight spilled across the clearing in wide, unbroken sheets. Dragonflies skimmed the air like fragments of living glass. This was not a place that demanded anything. That alone made it dangerous. Miles stepped out, boots hitting the earth with a muted thud. He wore a weathered olive field jacket, sleeves pushed up just enough to show his forearms. Beneath it, a red and dark blue plaid shirt hung loose, the fabric softened by time. His cargo pants were dark green, worn thin at the knees, and his brown leather boots bore the marks of long use rather than neglect. A battered military watch sat heavy on his wrist. A folding knife rode clipped in his pocket. Across his back, the Eberly stock half-track pack rested easily, its straps adjusted with the precision of someone who had carried weight for miles without complaint. Vesper exited on the opposite side, landing lightly, immediately shifting into motion. He moved forward in a wide arc, nose low, tail steady, scanning the perimeter with practiced economy. His ears rotated independently, catching distant sounds, the ripple of water, the buzz of insects, the faint creak of trees moving in the heat. Miles watched him, a faint curve touching the corner of his mouth. "You're off duty," he said quietly. Vesper did not acknowledge the comment. He never did. Miles began setting up camp near the tree line, choosing a spot where the ground was high and dry. His movements were methodical but unhurried. He drove the tent stakes into the soil at even angles, checking tension, adjusting lines. Still, the structure leaned slightly to one side. When he stepped back to assess it, Vesper had stopped his patrol and was watching. The dog tilted his head just enough to make the judgment unmistakable. Miles exhaled through his nose. "I see it." Vesper's ears flicked once. That was all. The moment passed, light as breath. But it did something important. It loosened a knot Miles hadn't realized he was still carrying. Humor for him was never loud. It arrived quietly, slipped in through the cracks. By late afternoon, the camp was settled. The sun hung lower, warming the lake to a deep, liquid blue. Miles sat on a fallen log and drank water slowly, listening. There were no engines here, no voices, only the layered sounds of summer, wind moving through leaves, insects calling, the occasional bird lifting and falling back into silence. This was what he had come for. And yet, as evening crept in and the stars began to surface one by one, Miles felt the familiar unease of transition. The hour between day and night had always been difficult for him. Too much light for rest. Too much shadow for certainty. He lit a small fire and warmed a simple meal. Vesper lay a few feet away, sphinx-like, eyes half-lidded but alert. The flames painted slow movement across the dog's coat, turning black fur to bronze, gold to ember. Miles stared into the fire and let his thoughts drift. Not backward, not forward, but inward. He thought of the years he had spent obeying orders that made sense at the time and less sense afterward. He thought of moments when silence had been easier than speaking, and how those silences had grown teeth. This land had come with restrictions, boundaries written in ink, lines he could not cross. He found comfort in that. The fire popped softly. Vesper rose, not abruptly, not in size, alarm. He simply stood, muscles tightening with quiet intention. His head lifted, his body angled, not toward the lake, not toward the camp, but toward the darker stretch of forest beyond the clearing. Miles felt it before he asked. The subtle shift in the air, the way sound seemed to pull inward. "What is it?" he murmured. Vesper did not bark, did not growl. He took 2 steps forward and stopped, planting himself as if marking an invisible threshold. The dog's tail was still. That was wrong. Miles set his cup down and rose slowly, heart rate steady but attentive. He followed the line of Vesper's gaze. There was nothing obvious there. No movement. No sound he could isolate. Just trees layered in shadow, standing exactly as they should have been. And yet the dog did not move. For a long moment, neither did Miles. He had learned, over years and scars, that the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. He had learned that the most dangerous things did not announce themselves. Finally, Miles placed a hand lightly on Vesper's shoulder. "Okay," he said. Not reassurance, acknowledgement. Vesper remained where he was, eyes fixed, listening to something the land had chosen not to share. Then, just as quietly as it had begun, The tension eased. Vesper stepped back, turned once, and returned to his place by the fire. The forest released its breath. Miles stood there for another minute, staring into the trees, before sitting back down. Whatever that had been, it had not been a warning. It had been a reminder. Night settled fully. The stars thickened overhead, mirrored faintly in the lake beyond the trees. Miles lay back against his pack, the earth firm beneath him, the sky vast above. Vesper positioned himself just outside the firelight, not sleeping, not pacing, simply present. Miles closed his eyes. He had not bought peace. He had bought a pause. And as the fire burned low and the forest wrapped itself around the clearing, Miles understood something with quiet clarity. The land was not empty. It was restrained. It held its history the way a seasoned man held grief. Not loudly, not urgently, but with patience. For now, that was enough. Morning arrived gently, carried in on warm air and the sound of water moving against stone. Sunlight slid across the clearing in long, golden bands, turning every blade of grass into something sharp and bright. Miles Kincaid woke before the birds finished negotiating the day. Habit did that. So did a mind that never fully powered down. He sat up slowly, listening. Nothing urgent answered him. No engines, no voices. Just the steady rhythm of summer, leaves stirring, insects rising, the lake breathing somewhere beyond the trees. For a moment, Miles allowed himself to believe that yesterday had been exactly what it looked like. A man and his dog arriving at a quiet place. Nothing more. Vesper was already awake. The German shepherd stood a few yards from the tent, facing east, his posture balanced and alert. At 6 years old, he had aged into himself. No wasted movement, no restless energy. His black and tan coat caught the sunlight in clean lines along his shoulders and back. When Miles stepped out, Vesper flicked an ear in acknowledgement but did not turn. Miles followed his gaze, then exhaled. "All right," he murmured. "Let's work." He pulled on his boots and field jacket, slung the half-track pack over one shoulder, and took out the small notebook he kept sealed in plastic. This was not exploration. It was orientation. The difference mattered. Miles moved methodically along the property line, pacing distances, checking elevation, marking trees with biodegradable tape. He recorded coordinates, noted changes in soil, slope, drainage. These habits had once been about survival. Now, they were about grounding. Reminding himself that the world could still be measured, understood, respected. Vesper worked the perimeter with him, but never close enough to crowd. The dog ranged ahead, then back, always keeping Miles within sight. His nose traced invisible paths through the air, catching stories Miles could not read. The sun climbed higher. Heat pressed gently against Miles's back. Sweat gathered beneath his collar, but he welcomed it. Warmth was honest. Warmth did not pretend to be something else. They reached the edge of a meadow where wild grass gave way to a low rise scattered with stones. Miles slowed, scanning the ground. The earth here looked ordinary. Too ordinary. No tracks, no broken stems, no obvious disturbance. Vesper stepped forward. Then he stopped. Not abruptly, not stiffly. He simply became still, every muscle settling into a posture Miles knew too well. The dog's head lowered a fraction. His weight shifted subtly back onto his hind legs, as if bracing against something unseen. Miles felt his chest tighten. He did not speak right away. Years ago, he had learned that sound could ruin a moment of clarity. He waited, letting the silence stretch until it felt deliberate. "What do you have?" he asked quietly. Vesper did not look at him. His amber eyes were fixed on a patch of ground where the grass grew slightly, thinner, the color just a shade off from the rest. The dog's tail was low and still. His ears were angled forward, catching something that did not carry sound. Miles approached slowly, careful not to crowd. He knelt beside Vesper and pressed his palm to the earth. It was firmer here, not compacted like a road, not rocky, just anchored, as if the soil resisted being disturbed. He inhaled. There it was, a faint metallic tang, so light it could have been imagined, but Miles almost dismissed it. Almost. He had once learned, the hard way, that almost was where mistakes lived. He smiled despite himself. If that's buried treasure, you're getting the good treats. Vesper did not move. The joke fell flat, dissolving in the air between them. When the dog was playful, Miles trusted the world. When Vesper was like this, focused, unmoving, Miles trusted nothing. Vesper stepped forward half a pace, his body angling just enough to block Miles's knee. A boundary. Miles froze, then nodded to himself. He withdrew his hand from the soil and reached instead for his notebook. He sketched a rough outline of the area, marked the coordinates, added a small symbol only he would recognize later. "Not today," he said softly. Vesper exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that felt like agreement. They moved on. For the next hour, Miles worked without incident, but his attention kept circling back. Not to fear, to curiosity, the kind that did not demand answers, but respected the fact that questions sometimes needed time. When the sun reached its highest point, Miles decided to head into town for supplies and information. Pine Haven sat just 15 minutes away, a place small enough to feel personal, old enough to have learned the value of memory. The drive was short. The town announced itself quietly, a single main street, a diner with sun-faded signage, a hardware store that smelled of wood and oil. Miles parked near the county records building, its brick facade worn smooth by decades of weather. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of paper. June Ellery looked up from behind the counter as Miles entered. She was in her early 60s, tall and spare, her gray hair pulled into a practical knot at the base of her neck. Her skin was fair, lined not by worry, but by years of squinting at maps and microfilm. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, and not easily impressed. "Can I help you?" she asked. Miles introduced himself and explained, without embellishment, that he had recently purchased land north of the lake and wanted to confirm boundary markers and access notes. June's fingers paused over the keyboard. "Which parcel?" she asked. He gave the number. June leaned back slightly in her chair, studying him more closely now. The worn boots, the military watch, the way he stood as if balance were a decision rather than a default. "That one doesn't get many long-term owners," she said. Miles met her gaze. "Why's that?" June considered him for a moment, then stood and gestured for him to follow. "Let's look." She led him to a long table and spread out a series of maps. The boundaries were clear, the topography detailed. But there were gaps, places where information simply stopped. "Nothing illegal," June said, tapping the page. "Just absent." Miles traced the empty space with his finger. Absent usually means someone took something out. June smiled thinly, or decided it was easier not to put it in. She glanced toward Vesper, who sat patiently near the door, eyes alert but calm. "Good dog," she said. Miles nodded. "Better than most people." June returned to the counter and printed a few documents. "You might also talk to Nora Beckett," she added. "County surveyor. If there's something odd about the land, she'll see it. Outside, the sun was blinding after the cool interior. Vesper rose as Miles stepped onto the sidewalk, tail giving a single, slow sweep. They walked back to the truck in silence. As Miles reached for the driver's door, Vesper stopped. He did not sit. He did not stiffen. He simply turned his head and stared across the street at the hardware store's dusty window. Miles followed his gaze. In the reflection, he saw himself. And just behind him, the county records building. The reflection wavered slightly in the heat, bending lines, distorting edges. For a brief, unsettling second, Miles felt as if he were looking at two versions of the same place. One as it was, one as it remembered being. Vesper's ears flicked once. Then the moment passed. Miles shook his head and opened the door, the reflection breaking apart into ordinary glass and sunlight. He told himself it was nothing, but the feeling stayed with him all the way back to the land. They returned in the late afternoon. The light had softened, turning the lake a deeper blue. Miles set his pack down and sat on the log again, notebook open on his knee. He reviewed what he had recorded. Coordinates, soil notes, gaps in the map. Vesper lay nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded. He looked relaxed, but Miles knew better. The dog was listening, to the land, to the air, to things that did not announce themselves. Miles closed the notebook and stared out across the clearing. He had come here to rest, to stop measuring, stop calculating, stop deciding. But the land had answered him not with peace, but with invitation. An invitation that did not demand acceptance, only awareness. He rubbed a hand over his face and let out a slow breath. "All right," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "I hear you." Vesper's tail tapped the ground once. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long and deliberate across the grass. Somewhere beneath the surface of the earth, something remained, unmoving, patient, and waiting. For now, Miles chose not to disturb it. Miles returned to the marked spot just after sunrise, when the light was still gentle and the air carried the cool promise of another clear day. He brought only what he needed: a compact shovel, a folding trowel, gloves, his notebook. No power tools, no haste. If the land had something to say, he intended to listen without shouting over it. Vesper walked beside him, calm and purposeful. The German shepherd moved with the quiet confidence of a seasoned canine. Head low, shoulders rolling smoothly, ears adjusting to every shift in sound. At 6 years old, his body was lean and strong, the black and tan of his coat catching flecks of sunlight as they passed through ferns and young pines. He did not rush ahead. He did not lag behind. He stayed close enough to intervene, far enough to observe. They reached the place Miles had marked the day before. The grass looked unchanged. Dew still clung to the blades, glittering like broken glass. A casual eye would have seen nothing wrong here. Miles knew better than to trust casual eyes. He knelt and brushed aside the top layer of moss with his gloved hand. The earth beneath was cool and damp, smelling of iron and roots. He worked slowly, carefully, lifting only what the ground allowed. When the edge appeared, it was unmistakable. Steel, straight, cold, unyielding, a rail. Miles paused, his breath shallow but controlled. He cleared a little more, just enough to confirm what he was seeing. The metal extended beyond the exposed section, disappearing back into the soil as if it had never meant to be found. A rail line did not appear by accident. Rails required planning, labor, purpose. They cut through land rather than adapting to it. This one did exactly that. running straight, indifferent to slope or tree line. Vesper stepped closer, nose hovering inches above the exposed metal. He did not touch it. He inhaled once, then turned and began to move forward, following the line with unerring precision. Miles stood and followed. They walked through a corridor of green that felt increasingly deliberate. Ferns gave way to low brush. Pines thinned, their roots twisting above ground like knuckles. The soil underfoot grew firmer, better drained. Whoever had laid this rail had known where to put it. The forest, for all its beauty, felt staged. When the structure came into view, Miles stopped short. A railcar sat ahead of them, tucked beneath a simple wooden canopy. The beams were weathered but sound, the roof angled just enough to shed rain. Moss crept along the edges, softening the lines, blending the structure into its surroundings. From above, from a distance, it would look like nothing more than a shadow among trees. The railcar itself was narrow and old, its metal sides dulled to a flat gray that reflected the summer light without shine. It rested squarely on the rails, aligned with a precision that suggested it had not moved since the day it arrived. There was no sense of abandonment here. Miles approached slowly, scanning for signs of disturbance. There were no fresh tracks, no broken branches, no obvious footprints beyond their own. The forest offered nothing. He reached for the door handle. It resisted him. Not frozen, not rusted solid, just stiff enough to remind him that time had passed. Miles took a small bottle of oil from his pocket and applied a careful drop. He waited, then turned the handle again, adding steady pressure. The hinge groaned softly, a sound like an old joint waking from sleep. Inside, the air was still but not stale. It smelled faintly of metal and old oil. Light filtered through a narrow window near the ceiling, illuminating a compact interior arranged with disciplined efficiency. A cast-iron stove sat in one corner, its pipe sealed neatly through the roof. A narrow table was bolted to the floor, its surface scarred with marks that spoke of measuring, sorting, recording. This was not a refuge. It was a workspace. Miles noticed the details immediately. A single screw newer than the others, its metal brighter. A rag stiff with dried oil tucked beneath the table. Faint handprints along the doorframe where someone had braced themselves repeatedly over time. Maintenance, yes, but minimal. Just enough to keep things functional. Just enough to ensure the railcar remained what it was meant to be. On the wall, a small metal label caught the light. The lettering was worn, but legible. Monitoring. Do not disturb. Miles exhaled slowly. Vesper stepped inside, then stopped. The dog did not explore. He did not sniff the corners or circle the space. He sat just inside the threshold, his body aligned with the doorway, ears forward, eyes fixed on Miles rather than the room. A boundary. Miles felt it settle in his chest, heavy and unmistakable. He scanned the interior once more, committing dimensions and placements to memory. He did not touch the stove. He did not open drawers. He measured angles with his eyes and stepped back out into the sunlight. He closed the door gently. They circled the structure, Miles counting steps, noting the thickness of the beams, the way the canopy extended just far enough to protect the railcar from direct rain and snow. This had been designed by someone who understood concealment, someone who knew how to let nature do the rest of the work. Miles pulled out his notebook and sketched quickly. Lines, angles, orientation. He marked the position of the rail relative to the lake and the clearing. He did not photograph it. Digital records traveled. Paper stayed where it was put. Vesper remained still, watching. After a time, Miles straightened and stepped back, increasing the distance between himself and the railcar. He felt the faint pull of curiosity, sharp and insistent. He also felt something else, restraint, shaped by experience rather than fear. "This isn't ours," he murmured. Vesper's tail gave a single, slow movement. They left the clearing as they had found it, careful not to disturb the moss or the grass. The forest closed in behind them, swallowing the straight lines with practiced ease. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when Vesper stopped again. This time, the dog turned his head sharply, ears angling toward a shallow depression near the railcar's rear corner, something Miles had missed. The ground there dipped subtly, the grass shorter, as if pressed down repeatedly over years. Miles followed Vesper's gaze and felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The depression was too regular, too clean. He took a step closer, then halted. Vesper did not block him. He did not sit. He simply looked back once, his expression unreadable but intent, and then returned his focus to the ground. Miles understood the message clearly enough. There was more here. And whatever it was, it extended beyond what could be seen. He marked the spot in his notebook without approaching further and turned away, his pulse steady but alert. Some thresholds did not announce themselves with doors. The walk back to camp was quiet. The sun climbed higher, the forest brightening as if nothing unusual had been revealed. Miles brewed coffee over his small stove and sat on the log, staring into the steam as it rose and vanished. He thought of rail lines that no longer appeared on maps, of projects that ended without explanation, of the cost of silence and the cost of speaking. Vesper lay nearby, his body relaxed, but his awareness unmistakable. He had not been meant to live quietly. Even at rest, there was something watchful about him, an attentiveness that did not fade. Miles took a long drink of coffee and set the cup aside. He had not come here looking for answers. He had come for quiet. But quiet, he was learning, was rarely empty. It was full of things waiting for the right kind of attention. He closed his notebook and slid it back into his pack. "For now," he said softly, "we wait." Vesper's ears flicked once. The land remained as it had been, sunlit, green, patient. Beneath it, something held its course, straight and deliberate, indifferent to time. Miles did not yet know what that meant, but he knew it mattered. Pinehaven revealed itself the way summer towns often did, without ceremony, without hurry. A single main street curved gently along the lake, its storefronts shaded by awnings that had faded to softer versions of themselves. The diner on the corner smelled of butter and hot coffee. Children rode their bikes in loose, looping circles, their laughter drifting like wind chimes through the warm air. Older residents sat on porches and benches, watching the day pass as if time were a familiar neighbor. Miles Kincaid parked his truck beneath a maple tree and sat for a moment with the engine off. The heat ticked softly under the hood. Vesper sat in the back seat, head high, eyes tracking the slow choreography of people and movement. He was calm here, not relaxed, but not braced either. Towns were complicated. Too many signals, too much overlap. "Stay," Miles said quietly. Vesper obeyed, lowering himself into a sphinx-like posture. Watching through the open window, the county records office occupied a squat brick building halfway down the street. Inside, the air was cooler, tinged with the dry smell of paper and dust. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. June Ellery looked up from behind the counter as Miles entered. She was taller than most women her age, her frame lean and straight-backed, as if posture were a matter of principle. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat knot at the base of her neck, not out of vanity but practicality. Her skin was fair, lined in a way that suggested long years of attention rather than worry. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm efficiency of someone who had learned that clarity saved time. "You must be the new landowner," she said, not unkindly. Miles nodded. Miles Kincaid. June's eyes flicked briefly to his boots, his watch, the way he stood without leaning. She didn't comment. She simply gestured toward the counter. "What can I help you with?" Miles explained what he needed. Boundary confirmation, historical access notes, anything unusual attached to the parcel. He spoke plainly, without drama. June listened without interrupting. When he gave her the parcel number, her fingers paused over the keyboard. "That one," she said slowly. She leaned back in her chair and studied him more closely now, curiosity sharpening her gaze. "You bought it knowing about the restrictions?" "Yes." June's mouth twitched. "Most people don't." She stood in motion for him to follow. "Let's take a look." They moved to a long table at the back, where rolled maps and folders lay stacked with careful disorder. June spread out several sheets, weighting the corners with small metal blocks. The lines were clean, the topography detailed. Forest boundaries, elevation contours, water flow. Everything a piece of land should have. And then, nothing. In the area Miles recognized immediately, the information thinned and then stopped. No utility lines. No historical overlays. No annotations beyond the bare minimum. June tapped the blank space with a finger. "This part's always been quiet." Miles traced the edge with his knuckle. "Quiet how?" "Not illegal," she said. "Just absent." "Absent usually means someone removed something," Miles replied. June's eyes met his. "Or decided it was easier not to put it in." She folded her arms loosely, considering. "You should talk to Nora Beckett." County surveyor. If there's something odd about land, she's the one who notices. As if summoned by name, the door opened and a woman stepped inside, carrying a rolled map under one arm. Nora Beckett was in her late 40s, average height, with a compact, athletic build that spoke of fieldwork rather than office hours. Her hair, dark blonde with a streak of silver, was pulled into a low ponytail. She wore practical clothes: denim shirt, work pants, boots scuffed with real use. Her eyes were quick and curious, always measuring. June gestured. "Nora, this is Miles Kincaid. He owns the Northern Tract." Nora raised an eyebrow. "That one?" Miles nodded again, feeling a pattern forming. Nora unrolled her map and leaned over the table. "The boundaries are solid," she said. "No disputes. But the overlays don't match the terrain. There are places where the land behaves like it remembers something the records don't." "Like what?" Miles asked. "Drainage patterns that don't make sense. Soil compaction in straight lines." She glanced up. "Nature doesn't do straight very often." Miles felt the quiet click of alignment in his chest. Before he could respond, the bell above the door jingled. Cal Hargrove shuffled in, wiping his hands on a rag bag that had once been white. He was well into his 70s, stooped slightly, with a face weathered by decades of grease and sun. His beard was thin and yellowed, his cap stained with oil. His eyes, though, were sharp, alert in a way that suggested he missed very little. "June," he said. "You got that gasket I ordered?" June nodded toward a shelf. "Right where it always is." Cal noticed Miles and nodded politely. "New face?" Miles returned the nod. "Just bought land north of the lake." Cal's hand froze mid-wipe. "North Tract?" he asked. Miles watched him carefully. "That's right." Cal's mouth tightened. He glanced at June, then back at Miles. "I worked the rail lines when I was younger," he said. "That land, Things went through there that didn't always go back out. Like what? Miles asked. Cal shrugged, a gesture heavy with years. Steel, equipment, people who didn't stay. He paused. One summer the lake smelled wrong. Metallic. Fish died. Then it stopped, and folks learned not to ask. Silence settled over the room, thick but not hostile. June cleared her throat. Ranger Mateo Ruiz might want to hear about this, she said. He's been tracking environmental concerns around the watershed. As if on cue, the door opened again. Ranger Mateo Ruiz stepped inside, sunlight framing his silhouette. He was in his late 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair cropped short and a neatly trimmed beard. His uniform was clean but worn, his posture relaxed in a way that came from competence rather than ease. His eyes were steady, thoughtful. Afternoon, he said. Everything all right? June gestured between them. Talking land. Mateo's gaze settled on Miles, assessing. If someone starts offering to buy your property quickly, he said, it usually means they know something you don't. Miles nodded slowly. That was when the man with the polite smile entered. Graham Weller moved like someone accustomed to being welcomed. He was in his early 40s, tall, well-groomed, his dark hair combed neatly back. His suit was light enough for summer, his shoes spotless. His smile was practiced but not insincere, just distant enough to keep emotion at arm's length. Afternoon, Graham said, extending a hand. Graham Weller, development consultant. Miles shook his hand. The grip was firm but brief. I couldn't help overhearing, Graham continued smoothly. I represent a group interested in responsible growth in the region, sustainable development, community-focused. His eyes flicked briefly to the maps on the table. We've been acquiring land near the lake, he said. I'd be happy to make an offer. Miles studied him. The careful words, the controlled enthusiasm, the way his gaze lingered on the blank spaces of the map rather than the detailed ones. I'm not selling, Miles said. Graham smiled, unfazed. Not today, he agreed. But opportunities have a way of ripening. He nodded politely to the room and stepped back outside, sunlight swallowing him whole. Miles returned to his truck a few minutes later. Vesper rose immediately, tail low, ears forward. He did not bark, he did not growl. As Graham Weller passed on the sidewalk, Vesper's eyes locked onto him. The dog's body stiffened, not in alarm, but in recognition. His gaze followed Graham until the man disappeared around the corner. Miles felt a chill move through him, sharp and precise. Easy, he murmured. Vesper sat, but his eyes remained fixed on the empty street long after Graham was gone. They drove back toward the land in silence. The sun dipped lower, warming the lake to a burnished blue. Miles parked at the edge of the clearing and stepped out, breathing in the scent of pine and water. The land looked unchanged, peaceful, indifferent, but it no longer felt empty. Miles set his pack down and opened his notebook, reviewing what he had learned. Restrictions, gaps, warnings, interest. He closed the notebook and looked at Vesper. We're not done listening, he said. Vesper's tail tapped the ground once. The forest remained still, holding its breath. Miles chose the middle of the day to return. The sun stood high and unambiguous, pouring light into the forest until even the shadows looked honest. He did it on purpose. Darkness had a way of inventing urgency where none was needed. If he was going to cross a threshold, he would do it with his eyes open and his breathing steady. He approached the railcar along the same careful path, boots landing where moss was already thin, hands free, shoulders loose. The wooden canopy creaked faintly as a breeze moved through the clearing, but the structure itself did not shift. It had been built to stay. Vesper walked at his side, close enough that Miles could feel the dog's warmth through the fabric of his field jacket. The German Shepherd's gait was smooth, economical. At 6 years old, Vesper carried himself like a veteran. No wasted motion, no unnecessary curiosity. His ears pivoted as they neared the door, catching the subtle sounds of wood and metal responding to heat. Miles reached for the handle. It resisted him again, not stubbornly, but with the firm patience of something that had learned not to yield quickly. He applied a single drop of oil, waited, and turned the handle with controlled pressure. The hinge groaned, low, deliberate, like an old joint agreeing to move. The door swung inward. Light spilled across the interior, revealing a space that was smaller than it looked from outside and far more deliberate than any shelter had a right to be. The air inside was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of metal, oil, and old smoke. Long dissipated, but not forgotten. Miles stepped inside. The railcar was arranged with disciplined efficiency. A cast-iron stove occupied one corner, its pipe fitted cleanly through a sealed opening in the roof. A narrow table was bolted directly to the floor, its surface marked by shallow grooves and scratches that followed patterns, measuring, aligning, recording. Shelves lined one wall, each holding tools arranged by size and function. Tin cups, a kettle, small containers labeled in a hand that favored clarity over flourish. There were no personal effects, no photographs, no books, no extra clothing, no sign that anyone had ever intended to be comfortable here. This was not a place to rest. It was a place to work. Miles moved slowly, eyes tracing the geometry of the space. He noted the angle of the stovepipe, the thickness of the table bolts, the way the shelves had been reinforced against vibration. Whoever had built this understood load, heat, and time. They had planned for use, not presence. Behind him, Vesper stepped inside and stopped. The dog did not circle the room. He did not sniff the stove or the shelves. He planted himself just inside the doorway, body aligned with the threshold, ears forward. A low sound rolled from his chest. Not a growl meant to threaten, but something tighter, controlled. A warning shaped by restraint. Miles froze. He followed the line of Vesper's gaze to the floor. At first the difference was subtle. A shift in grain, a change in tone. One section of the wooden planks did not match the others. The boards were newer, treated, their edges fitted with a precision that had nothing to do with age or accident. A patch of floor that did not belong. Miles knelt, careful not to cross the invisible line Vesper seemed to be guarding. He ran his fingers along the seam. There was no handle, no obvious latch. Whoever had installed it had not wanted it found quickly. His chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. Years ago, in another place under a different sun, Miles had stood in a room like this, maps spread across a table, details dismissed as minor because there was pressure to move, to finish, to obey the momentum of a plan already in motion. He had noticed something then, a discrepancy, a pause in his gut, and chosen to keep quiet. No one died that day. But someone had been hurt badly enough that the cost followed Miles home, etched into memory rather than scar tissue. He had learned something since. Silence was a decision. Miles withdrew his hand from the floor and sat back on his heels. He did not reach for his phone. He did not photograph the space from every angle. Instead, he opened his notebook and began to draw. Dimensions, distances, orientation, the position of the table relative to the stove, the shelves, the mismatched section of floor. He wrote down the time, the direction of the breeze outside, the quality of the light. This was how he bore witness. Vesper remained still, his presence heavy and grounding. The dog's amber eyes never left the floor. After several minutes, Miles closed the notebook and rose slowly. He took one last look around the railcar, committing the room to memory, then stepped backward into the sunlight. He closed the door gently. The hinge settled without complaint. Outside, the clearing felt brighter, louder, as if the forest were making a point of reminding him where he stood. Birds called, insects hummed. The canopy overhead creaked softly. Miles leaned against one of the wooden support beams and exhaled. His pulse was steady, but his thoughts were not. The railcar had not been abandoned. It had been maintained. Not lovingly, not comfortably, just enough to remain useful. Useful for what? He resisted the urge to speculate. Speculation filled gaps with noise. He needed quiet. Vesper stepped out beside him and shook once, scattering dust and a few stray pine needles. The dog's posture eased slightly, but his attention did not drift. He sat facing the railcar, back straight, eyes calm but unyielding. A sentry. Miles glanced at his watch and then at the sun. He had time. He always had time. The danger came from pretending he didn't. He packed up and returned to camp, carrying the weight of what he had seen without letting it bend him out of shape. He brewed coffee, drank it slowly, and waited for his thoughts to settle into something orderly as the afternoon wore on. Miles returned to the clearing, not to enter the railcar again, but to observe. Vesper moved ahead of him, stopping several feet short of the canopy. The dog's head tilted slightly, ears adjusting, not toward the railcar door, but toward the ground beside it. Miles followed his gaze. There, half hidden by grass and shadow, was a subtle depression in the earth. Not a hole, not a trench, just a shallow dip, too uniform to be natural, its edges softened by time rather than erosion. Miles crouched and studied it from a distance. He did not touch it. He did not step into it. The shape suggested repetition, weight applied again and again over years. Whatever lay beneath the railcar had not been the only thing down there. The realization settled quietly, like a stone placed in his pocket. By late afternoon, the light had shifted, slanting through the trees at a lower angle. Miles returned to the railcar one last time and walked its length slowly, counting steps, measuring spacing. He traced the line of the rails beneath the canopy and noted how perfectly aligned they remained. Straight lines. They did not wander. They did not adapt. They cut. Miles replaced the moss he had disturbed earlier, pressing it back into place with care. He erased his own footprints where he could. The forest had been generous enough to reveal something. He would return the favor by leaving as little of himself behind as possible. At camp, he sealed his notebook in its plastic sleeve and stowed it deep in his pack. He did not sleep immediately when night came. Instead, he sat with his back against a tree and watched the stars appear one by one. Vesper lay at his feet, head resting against Miles's boot. The dog's breathing was slow, even. He was not guarding. He was anchoring. Miles stared out into the dark and let the memory of the railcar replay, not as a threat, but as a question. He had come here to disappear into quiet. But quiet, he was learning, did not mean absence. It meant containment. It meant things held in place by intention rather than neglect. Miles rested a hand on Vesper's shoulder. "Not yet," he said softly. The dog did not move. Some doors, Miles knew now, were meant to be closed. Not because they were empty, but because they were waiting for the right reason to be opened. Miles did not open the floor panel right away. He stood in the railcar doorway with his phone pressed to his ear, sunlight warming the back of his neck, listening to the steady voice on the other end of the line. "Confined spaces are unforgiving," Ranger Mateo Ruiz said. "Even the clean ones. Pockets of gas, weak steps, animals nesting. If you go down there, you treat it like it wants to kill you." Miles looked at Vesper, who sat just outside the door, alert but calm. "Understood," Miles replied. "I'll prep." "Good," Mateo said. "And Miles, if something feels off, you don't push through it. You back out." That, Miles thought, was advice learned the hard way. He ended the call and moved with quiet efficiency. Rope first, static line, anchored to a support beam he had already tested for load. 2 lights, 1 primary, 1 backup. Fresh batteries. A simple filter mask. Not for heroics, just insurance. Gloves. Notebook sealed in plastic. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was responsibility. Miles knelt and placed both hands on the mismatched floor panel. He lifted slowly, controlling the weight so it wouldn't slam back down. The panel rose smoother than expected, heavier than it looked, revealing a square opening cut with professional precision. A staircase descended into darkness. Concrete steps, clean edges. A narrow drainage channel ran along one side, stained faintly with mineral residue. The walls were sealed with moisture-resistant coating, still intact. Electrical conduit hugged the concrete, wires cut cleanly and capped, not torn. This space had not been abandoned in panic. It had been shut down deliberately. Miles tested the first step with his boot. Solid. He clipped the rope to his harness and began his descent, counting each step under his breath. The air below was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of concrete and old metal. No standing water. No rot. At the bottom, the space opened wider than he had expected. Steel beams supported the ceiling. Shelving units lined one wall, bolted directly into the floor. Metal cases sat in neat rows, each labeled in fading stencil. A desk stood near the center, its surface worn smooth where hands had rested again and again. This was not storage. This was infrastructure. Miles swept the room with his light, methodical, controlled. He opened one case and froze. Inside were sealed containers, each carefully packed. Labels were still legible. Lake sample, AU 2009. Another case held rolled maps, edges softened from repeated use. He unrolled one carefully. A familiar shoreline appeared, marked with shaded zones radiating outward like bruises. Plume modeling, contamination mapping. Miles exhaled slowly, the sound loud in the quiet room. On the far wall, a metal placard caught the beam of his flashlight. Environmental Monitoring Station. The words settled into him with a weight he did not welcome. This place hadn't been built to hide something that happened once. It had been built to watch something over time. Miles documented what he could without disturbing a thing. He noted labels, positions, dates. He resisted the urge to speculate. Speculation could wait. Facts could not. He climbed back up, sealed the floor panel, and closed the railcar door with deliberate care. Outside, the afternoon sun felt almost intrusive. Vesper rose immediately, moving to Miles's side, eyes searching his face. "I know," Miles murmured. "I saw it too." They walked away from the railcar, Miles's mind already shifting from observation to obligation. They were halfway back to camp when the wind changed. Vesper's head snapped up, ears rigid. His body tensed. Not fear, not alarm, but urgency. Without waiting for a command, the dog broke into a run, cutting left toward the lakeshore. "Vesper!" Miles called, already moving. The dog sprinted ahead, weaving through brush with explosive speed. Miles followed, boots pounding the earth, heart steady despite the sudden shift. He trusted this instinct more than any map. They burst through the trees to the edge of the lake. A boy stood knee-deep in mud near the waterline, frozen, eyes wide with panic. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, thin, sunburned, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Each movement pulled him deeper into the soft ground. Vesper reached him first. The German shepherd planted himself between the boy and the deeper mud, stance wide and unyielding. He barked, not frantic, not aggressive, but sharp and rhythmic. A signal. The boy stared at him, breath hitching. "It's okay," Miles said, arriving seconds later. "Don't move." Miles assessed the ground quickly. The mud was deceptive, firm looking on top, hungry underneath. He looped his rope around a nearby tree and moved closer, low and slow. Vesper did not move. He held his position, eyes locked on the boy, body blocking the worst of the danger. When Miles reached him, the dog shifted just enough to allow the rope through, then resumed his stance. Miles secured the rope around the boy's waist. "Lean back," he instructed gently. "Let me do the work." With steady pressure, Miles pulled. The mud released its grip reluctantly, but it released. The boy stumbled forward, collapsing against Miles's chest, shaking but unhurt. Moments later, frantic voices echoed from the trail. A woman ran toward them, breathless, her dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, her face pale with fear. She couldn't have been much over 30, tall and slender, her movements sharp with panic, held barely in check. "Ethan!" she cried. The boy turned. "Mom!" She reached them and dropped to her knees, pulling her son into her arms. Her hands trembled as she held him, tears streaking down her sun-warmed cheeks. "I turned my back for 1 minute," she whispered. 1 minute. "You did everything right," Miles said quietly. "He's okay." The woman looked up at him, really seeing him now. The worn boots, the calm eyes, the dog standing like a statue beside them. "Thank you," she said, voice breaking. "Both of you." Vesper stepped forward and licked the boy's muddy hand once, then sat, duty fulfilled. As they waited for the woman's husband to arrive, the boy pointed toward the trees. "Your dog didn't bark at me," he said softly. "He just stood there, like he knew." Miles felt something tighten in his chest. Vesper looked back at him then, amber eyes steady, unreadable. Some instincts, Miles knew, didn't just sense danger. They recognized it. After the family left, gratitude trailing behind them like a wake, Miles stood at the water's edge for a long moment. The lake shimmered in the afternoon light, beautiful and deceptively calm. The samples underground, the maps, the boy's narrow escape. This was no longer a private reckoning. Back at camp, Miles cleaned his gear and sat with his phone in his hand. He scrolled to a name he hadn't used in years, Ben Stroud. Ben had been his liaison once, quiet, methodical, allergic to drama. A man who understood chain of custody and why it mattered. The call connected on the third ring. "Miles," Ben said, surprise threading his voice. "Didn't expect to hear from you." "I found something," Miles replied, "and someone almost got hurt because of it." There was a pause. "Then you did the right thing calling," Ben said. Miles stared out at the trees, Vesper lying nearby, head on his paws, eyes open. "I have documentation," Miles continued. "Untouched, location logged. I need this handled clean." "Send nothing digitally," Ben replied. "Sit tight. I'll take it from here." Miles ended the call as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the clearing. He had crossed the threshold, not by opening a door, but by refusing to ignore what lay beyond it. Vesper shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against Miles's leg. The land was still bright, still peaceful, but now it was awake. They arrived just after 9 in the morning, not with sirens, not with urgency, just a line of unmarked state vehicles easing onto the forest road as if they had always belonged there. Miles watched from the edge of the clearing, arms relaxed at his sides, posture neutral. Vesper sat beside him, calm and observant, his ears tracking the soft crunch of tires on gravel. The lead vehicle stopped first. A woman stepped out, mid-50s perhaps, average height, broad-shouldered, her hair cut short and practical. She wore a state DNR jacket faded at the seams, boots dusted with real soil, not office floors. Her face held no surprise, only focus. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, extending a hand. "Laura McKenna, Department of Natural Resources. Case numbers already open." Miles shook her hand, firm, professional. "You were expecting this?" he asked. Laura gave a faint, humorless smile. "We were expecting something. Dormant file site. That means a file that stays asleep until the landowner speaks up. Chain of custody depends on that." Behind her, technicians moved with quiet efficiency. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Tripods went up. Sample kits opened. Clipboards appeared. The railcar was approached not with curiosity, but confirmation. That, more than anything, unsettled Miles. They weren't surprised. A man in his early 40s joined Laura, tall, narrow-framed, with wire-rimmed glasses and a clipped beard already showing gray. He introduced himself as Aaron Feld, environmental engineer. His voice was soft, precise, as if volume were wasted energy. "We'll take soil cores first," Aaron said. "Then water samples from 3 depths. After that, we seal." "And the underground station?" Miles asked. Aaron nodded. "Already documented. Permanently decommissioned today." They worked through the afternoon. Samples were bagged and labeled, coordinates logged, photos taken, measurements recorded. The hatch beneath the railcar was opened one final time, documented, then closed. Concrete was poured, reinforced with steel mesh, smoothed with care, not erased, contained. Miles stood with Vesper near the tree line, watching. The process felt colder than secrecy ever had. This was proof that what he'd found wasn't a rumor, or a theory, or a mistake. It had happened. By late afternoon, the work was done. Laura approached him again, a folder tucked under her arm. "You have 2 options," she said, without ceremony. "Sell the property. The state facilitates the transfer. You sign a non-disclosure. The land gets absorbed into a managed buffer." "And the other?" "You keep it," Laura replied, "with restrictions, development setbacks. No structures along the lake's eastern edge. Periodic inspections. No notice." Miles didn't answer right away. The forest hummed around them, cicadas, wind through leaves, the ordinary music of summer. Before he could speak, another vehicle rolled up. Graham Weller stepped out, as if on cue. Same clean suit, same measured smile. Sunglasses this time, which he removed as he approached, eyes sharp with calculation. "Miles," he said warmly, "I heard things were complicated." Miles said nothing. "I'm prepared to make a generous offer," Graham continued. "Well above market. Cash. Quick close. You walk away without headaches." Vesper rose to his feet. Not aggressively, just deliberately. He positioned himself slightly in front of Miles, body angled. Not blocking, not challenging. Present. Graham's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Miles. His smile tightened. Laura cleared her throat. "This conversation happens with us present, Mr. Weller." Graham chuckled lightly. "Of course." Miles looked from Graham to the folder in Laura's hands. Silence pressed in. Not empty, but expectant. He thought of the underground room, of the boy by the lake, of the years he'd carried one unmade call like a weight that never quite settled. "I'm keeping the land," Miles said. Graham blinked once. "You're sure?" "Yes," Laura nodded. "Then you accept the conditions." Miles took the folder. "I do." Graham exhaled through his nose. Polite disappointment etched carefully onto his face. "If you change your mind." "I won't," Miles said. Graham studied him a moment longer, then smiled again. "Well, enjoy your peace." He left without another word. The DNR vehicles followed not long after, the clearing returning to itself piece by piece. Only one thing remained. A short section of rail, no more than a few feet, half buried in soil near the edge of the clearing. Too small to lead anywhere. Too deliberate to remove. Laura paused beside it. "The Historical Society asked about preserving the railcar," she said. "Secured, monitored, interpreted someday." "And the rail?" Miles asked. She glanced at it. "That can stay, marked as industrial debris. Context matters." She hesitated, then added, "You did the right thing." Miles watched her leave. That evening, after the forest had gone quiet again, Vesper walked back to the remaining rail on his own. He lay down beside it, aligning his body along the metal, chin resting near the cool steel. Not guarding it, not avoiding it. Just there. Miles felt something in his chest loosen, not relief exactly, but release. Some markers weren't warnings, they were acknowledgments. The sun slid lower, turning the lake copper and red. Miles sat on a fallen log, brushing Vesper's coat with slow, practiced strokes. Loose fur drifted away on the breeze. "You know," Miles said, dry humor threading his voice, "pretty sure you're the one making the calls around here." Vesper's tail thumped once. Miles laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. The land stretched around them, changed, but intact. Restricted, but honest. Peace, he realized, wasn't the absence of limits. It was choosing the right ones. He rested his hand on the warm fur at Vesper's shoulder and watched the sun disappear beyond the trees. Behind them, the rail caught the last light of day. Dull, quiet, unforgotten, and that was enough. And that was, sometimes, the miracle is not what is revealed, but what is stopped in time. We often imagine God's work as something loud or unmistakable. A door opening, a storm parting, an answer arriving all at once. But more often, His presence shows up as a pause, a hesitation we cannot explain, a quiet sense that tells us to slow down when the world urges us to rush. In this story, the miracle was not hidden underground in steel and concrete. It was found in restraint, in listening, in the courage to make the call that once went unmade, in a man who chose responsibility over comfort, and in a dog who knew when to stand still instead of charging forward. In our daily lives, we face moments like this more often than we realize. A truth we sense but hesitate to speak. A responsibility we delay because silence feels easier. A small inner warning we dismiss because it disrupts our plans. Faith is not always about moving forward. Sometimes, faith is about stopping when something within us says, "Pay attention." If you are watching this while carrying the weight of a past silence, may God offer you peace. If you are facing a decision you've been postponing, may He give you clarity. And if life feels overwhelming or uncertain, may God place a quiet sign in your path and give you the courage to recognize it. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need it today. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what this story reminded you of. And if you believe in stories that honor courage, faith, and the bond between humans and dogs, subscribe to this channel so we can continue walking this path together. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps in both the loud moments and the quiet ones that matter most.